respect everybody's time. Yeah, I'm ready. Oh, it's me. I didn't see myself yesterday. All right. Welcome to day two, which is really week two, but day two. It's good to have you all back for another session. This is our first course that we've actually taught, but we've developed many more. This course focusing on Freedom Summer, and we have developed courses on Black Power, Nonviolent Direct Action, and Lowndes County Freedom Organization in its contexts. So this particular section or week or day, we're going to move into the creation of SNCC proper, and we've talked about the evolution of the terrain of Mississippi, but that ultimately is shifted, or SNCC, when it enters into the state, helps develop a shift in that terrain. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, pursuing those grand questions of Black studies approaches to this idea. Who were the people in who were the people in Mississippi? And then who was SNCC? And then how did that transform the how and the why of Freedom Summer? And thinking again about this within a larger context of Black revolutionary struggle and the Black freedom struggle, and this whole question of how it's going to free us. How is this going to free us? So yesterday, we put Mississippi in context and talked about some of the concerns that Black people launched into the arena when it came to the Civil War and Reconstruction. And as we talked about yesterday, the only real revolutionary possibility up until that point in American history. And that, of course, offered us some foundation, some ground to stand on when it came to understanding that Mississippi was a place of a vibrant and very active struggle in the Black community that, of course, was violently suppressed. And I just want to offer one correction to the narrative that we developed yesterday. A small, minor one, but it's a complicated one, and it has to do with the idea of equal pay. I think Justin asked this question around whether or not the soldiers were ever granted equal pay, the Black soldiers, United States colored troops. And it's tricky because the law changed, and I think the law changed in June of 1864. That's the part that I forgot. So they changed the law, and they were supposed to get back pay. They were supposed to get equal pay and back pay. But by October, the National Equal Rights League was still demanding that the soldiers be paid equally. And so I haven't seen a document that confirms whether or not this came through officially from the United States government. Did Black soldiers ever get their back pay, or did they ever get, equal salaries? So that's something that maybe I'll go into the archives at some point, or look into secondary sources. But I've never seen it confirmed that they actually got it. So that's still up in the air. So, but they did actually change the law. Congress basically made it the law that they had to go back and pay them their rightful wage, their rightful salary, which I think is an important question and consideration, because reparations was a major program of Black freedom struggle in the late 19th century. And the whole question of whether or not formerly enslaved people would receive pensions, right? Elder care, like all of these basic, what we would call welfare amenities. That was a big part of the reparation struggle, or the conception of reparations as well. And land is connected to that claim as well. And so when Mississippi, for instance, ultimately does not put that on the table or takes that off the table, and black people are returned to servitude in many respects, that of course allows for, or this disenfranchisement allows for that to continue. Disenfranchisement plus terror allows for that to continue, even as you have examples of black people owning their land, owning their own farms, developing, into developing their own political activities. Despite all of that, you still have the masses, the majority of the formerly enslaved people suffering under the yoke of the policy of refusal of reparations, reparative justice, and disenfranchisement. So those two things work together. Jim Crow was not just a social question, right? It wasn't just, we don't want to sit next to these people. It was, we want to control their labor. And recognizing that is a critical part, because we know, and Julian Bond talks about this very specifically, we know that so much of the master narrative of the civil rights struggle is around the social graces of the South, and this idea of integration becomes something about this notion of a common brotherhood and sisterhood, and we should all go to the same church and things like that. But in reality, Jim Crow is an economic project, and this really was a materialist feature of the American economy. It had a materialist implications, which is why they held on to it for so long. And that has really important implications for how we conceive of the options that were available to black people struggling in Mississippi. It's one thing to say that, we're struggling to integrate the social world. It's completely another thing to say that we want to fully disrupt capitalism and make sure that people have their basic human needs met, whether or not it meets capital's needs or not. And that was why we talked a little bit about, or we read a little bit from Du Bois about this idea of the two central suns being far apart. One is an economic program, the other is a moral program. And they met and then they departed just as quickly as they met. And that's what leads to the catastrophe, what he calls several times. What I like the way that Du Bois uses uses metaphor, but also the way that he describes these conditions. He would say that was the price of the disaster, the price of disaster. In several other points, he says, black people descended into hell. It's like, okay, that's a great description. What does that mean? Black people descended into hell. So that's the framing for us picking up the discussion. In the 1940s, many important things happened, including America's participation in the Second World War. And throughout the South, black men and women are, I don't want to say impressed into service, but there's this idea that we should serve. And W.E.B, or the Double Victory Campaign, was a major, perhaps propaganda, coming from the black press, Pittsburgh Courier primarily, which is not just, circulated in Pittsburgh. It was a national newspaper. And black people joined the Army. And Southern black people, in particular, are joining the Army and recognizing that fascism is a threat, right? I think I mentioned yesterday that we know how to fight fascism. We are not without the legacy of fighting fascism, and hopefully, one of my favorite thinkers and someone who I've written about extensively, Cedric J. Robinson, was actually working on a manuscript about black anti-fascism for much of the 1980s. You can imagine that being the sequel to Black Marxism. It's just like, wait a minute. Yes, there's a black anti-fascist tradition as well. But what is interesting about Second World War is that black people understood that fascism was also in the United States. It wasn't just Germany. It wasn't just Italy. They recognized the connections between Germany and Italy and Jim Crow. And now, of course, you got Johnny-come-latelys who are talking about, well, they learned, the Germans learned it from Jim Crow, right? Of course. Well, black people were saying that in the 1940s. And this was important because many of the soldiers felt that by fighting fascism, abroad, they were also fighting it at home, right? There's this belief that we can fight on two terrains, and it's logical, right? It makes a lot of sense that they were thinking about a notion of democracy that they have never experienced. And the reason that they had never experienced is because they recognized that Jim Crow was a fascist project. And the ability to get into a space where they could actively oppose it under the sanction of the United States Army is really akin to the ways in which they fought against slavery. Their forefathers that fought against slavery under the sanction of the United States Army during the Civil War. Very few people think about black participation in World War II in those terms, though. I find that interesting. And for me, the ability to read the narratives of black soldiers, many of whom would become important political figures in their own right. For instance, Nelson Peary is one of my favorite examples of this, who would eventually become a black communist, but he, in many ways, joins the war effort because he supports the Soviet Union. It's like there's a cadre of black people who are pro-Soviet, right? And they decide that the best way to get involved in the fight is to come in on the side of the United States, of course, because the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. But their reasons for fighting were revolutionary. And then you have people in the South who are from places like Louisiana and Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, Alabama, who are joining the war effort, and ultimately they're saying, look, we're not going to be able to fully integrate the military, but what we can do is get training in weapons. What we can do is get training in military strategy. And what we can do is protect our communities when we get back. This idea was very important because in a place like Mississippi or in a place like Louisiana, you actually have installations of the United States Army, right? All the forts. I want to name all of them, right? But these black regiments, when they showed up, it could mean war, literally. Not in Europe, but in Louisiana, right? And so Nelson Peary talks about how they ended up being trained on the West Coast somewhere, but they were sent to Louisiana to await orders or to await where they were going to go next, right? During the Second World War. And when they came to Louisiana, the local people was like, oh, snap, a black regiment, a whole black regiment. Here's our solution to our problems. And they began to come to the soldiers like, look, y'all got the training. Here's what's happening here. And over time, those soldiers who may have came from other parts of the South or may have even come from parts of the North began to reconceptualize that, hey, we don't have to go to Germany to fight fascism. We can organize here. And as that is happening, you start to see these mini conflicts that are happening among these soldiers all around the South. And eventually you get regiments that are branded as troublemaker regiments, and they get shipped off to the South Pacific or wherever they could get rid of them. And even then the organizing didn't stop. So it's a really fascinating thing because every SNCC person will tell you that when they first entered a state like Louisiana, Mississippi, or Alabama, particularly Mississippi and Alabama, the peoples that were already organized were World War II veterans. They were World War II veterans. And so whether we're talking about Medgar Evers, who I mentioned yesterday, right, or others like Amzie Moore, talk about a little bit today, right? These are people that have been shaped by black participation in the Second World War, which is not just a fight for a limited notion of American democracy. For many soldiers, it was about the revolutionary possibility of destroying white supremacy in total. And the failure to realize that in the ensuing years, the disappointment that they faced in 1946, 47, 1948, when they come back home and nothing changed. In fact, there's an increase in violence because Now you uppity Negroes got on our country's uniform. Let's teach you a lesson. There were accounts of black soldiers being lynched in their uniforms, right? That shapes that particular moment. But the other side of it is how many of those black soldiers were considering fascism as not just a foreign import, but something that they were facing literally in their own communities. So it's a logical conclusion to draw that they would continue to organize against it in the ensuing years of the 1950s. That's the terrain of Mississippi. And it's very interesting. Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture talks about this in Ready for Revolution, his autobiography, that those years, the post-Second World War II years and pre-Brown versus Board of Education years, it was actually a little bit better than what would come after Brown, right? And the reason for that is Brown not only radicalizes the so-called redneck population, right? The J.W. Millums and, the Byron De La Beckwiths and those types. Brown actually radicalizes the white entrepreneurial class. And that is what ultimately makes the terrain in Mississippi, Alabama, and other parts of the South much more difficult after 1954. Brown versus Board of Education is pivotal for many different reasons, but it ultimately makes the terrain much more difficult because the emergence of something called the White Citizens Council. And these were people who felt that they could fight the war not by lynching black people, right? Not by terrorizing black people, but through economic reprisals, which is a very interesting tactic because they identified that these same World War II veterans, many were entrepreneurial. Many had their own businesses. Many were able to, establish themselves as landowners, but they were also members of the only game in town at the time, which was the NAACP. The NAACP emerged, of course, in the South as a bulwark against Jim Crow, but ultimately it was guided by the local chapter's orientation, not necessarily by the dictates of the national office. This is extremely important. I think the probably most famous example of this comes later with Robert F. Williams in Monroe, North Carolina, right? Local chapters dealt with local issues on their own terms. And sometimes that ran up against what Roy Wilkins and others in the national office wanted to do. And so you could have people who are in NAACP and also, I'm going to carry around my revolver to the chapter meeting because you don't know what it's like to be in the NAACP, right, down here. Which, of course, meant that they recognized that these reprisals were a major part of the game, that you knew that you could lose your job or lose access to credit at the bank or lose business as a consequence of participating in NAACP. What's interesting about Mississippi is they began to develop not alternatives, but organizations that ran alongside the NAACP. I think one of those major ones was the RCNL, the Regional Council. I think it's Regional Council of Negro Leadership. It's ran by a physician by the name of Dr. T.R.M. Howard, and he was kind of a flashy guy. He had a convertible. He had like a mansion with servants, but he was also down with the struggle. It was very interesting. But he felt that, part of what we got to do is like create indigenous local organizing. And that means that bringing like this black middle class, community together and pooling their resources and pooling their access to capital to actually effectively drive home the idea that we should vote as a block, we should vote as a group. And this is important because this is the era of like Eastland and Bilbo saying, like, some of y'all got to go back to Africa. Like, they're actually saying this to Mississippi at the same time. It's very interesting. So Howard, alongside many other local organizers who are part of this black middle class, are devising schemes for voter registration as early as the 1950s, and then after Brown, they are forcing or trying to force the state of Mississippi to enforce it, because we know that Brown has no real enforcement power. In fact, Brown 2, which is the second Brown decision, 1955, gives the famous language of all deliberate speed. That you have to integrate, but take your time. All deliberate speed. And so how they devise a plan to help to make sure that they enforce this is another lesson in organizing, because they're seeing this question of the integration of schools as a question of resources. And the conservative nature of the Mississippi government was at the same time promising, like the HBCUs in the state, Alcorn, and the precursor, I could forget the name of the precursor to Mississippi Valley State and others. We'll give you, equal funding. It's like, do we believe you? And so they're promising equal funding if you just get rid of the whole idea that we have to enforce Brown, which is an attractive thing if you believe them. But why would you believe them? And that's the whole debate happening in the black middle class at the time. And then, of course, 1955, right? Emmett Till. And not just Emmett Till, but a rash of other violent murders of black people. And, Emmett Till's murder, of course, because the images were broadcast or the images were published, it, of course, affects the young people in a very different way. I can still hear Dory Latner, Ma'akru, who recently transitioned, and her sister, Joyce Latner, talking or describing themselves as members of the Emmett Till generation. Like that was something that really affected them. And so they began to recognize that, as you said yesterday, they can kill us with impunity, right? How do we organize against this? And so Dory and Joyce, they looked to the elders. It was interesting. Dory and Joyce, they came from a community, and I think this is something that's going to come up several times today. They came from a community where black people were relatively autonomous, right? Palmer's Crossing, Mississippi, and which is adjacent to a place called Hattiesburg, one of the largest cities. In fact, one of the few cities that can be called a city in Mississippi at the time. And, they were brought up into the movement, not just through their families and this autonomous community, but also by elders like Vernon Dahmer, Dahmer, Vernon Dahmer, who is, NAACP and a business owner. I mean, this is like a common thing, right? Like, even to be black and middle class, you're not necessarily wealthy, but you are autonomous, and that was the key. You don't start a business to exploit people. You start a business to be autonomous, which is like a very different orientation. And I think the story that Dory and Joyce tells about their early life is really instructive in that sense, right? Because you don't want to have our people have to be subject to going into places to patronize white racists. And then, the story that Dory and Joyce tells is they were going to a store in Hattiesburg. I think it was in Hattiesburg. And one of the store owners, or the owner of the store, actually gropes Dory. And Dory goes home, and sorry, let me tell the story correctly. So Dory and Joyce are in the store. Dory gets groped. She's 13 or 14 years old by the store owner. And, it's very interesting. Dory just transitioned, and the New York Times doesn't tell the story straight, which is in an obituary. They didn't tell this story straight. So that's why I'm like, let me tell this story straight. Dory turns around and has a sack of donuts in her hand, and she beats the man over the head with the sack of donuts. Now, mind you, this is after what happened to Emmett Till, right? And so they're frightened. And they go home. Dory and Joyce go home, and they tell their mother what happened. And this is the part that the New York Times leaves out. Dory's mom says, well, why didn't you kill him? Don't ever let a white man do that to you. It's like, wait a minute. who are these people? And so when people talk about the courage of a Dory Ladner, right, it's a community that forges her. It's Palmer's Crossing, and it's the ability of these young people to recognize terror, but also being fortified to stand up against it in a very real way, and not just in a nonviolent way. And I think that Hollis Watkins is another example. He says, I didn't grow up nonviolent. Nobody told me to ever be nonviolent. What is this? Right? Hollis Watkins also grows up in a community that is relatively autonomous. Summit, Mississippi. I don't think that's even on the map. Chisholm Mission, Mississippi. These very, very small communities. And that's in the Delta, I believe. Hattiesburg is in the southern part of the state. So you have people like, Hollis Watkins, who is so beautiful. Like, he has this really brilliant autobiography called Brother Hollis. And I just can't get over the first few chapters of it, because he describes the ways that rural people in Mississippi align with the rhythm of nature and the timing of agriculture and how their work patterns. Oh, it's just a beautiful way that he expresses it. And then there's the music that goes along with it, right? Because he was one of the great voices, musical voices, singing voices of SNCC. But what it showed me when I read it is that obviously these people aren't empty-handed, but there's this whole philosophy of life embedded in the ways that they made meaning of not just their relationship to the structure, but how you build community despite that structure, how you build a sense of what to do. He says, and he talks about a little bit about this in the video for this section. He says, I went to Los Angeles after I graduated. I'm like, I don't want to be here. The action is in Mississippi. I want to go back home. He said, I saw the Freedom Riders, and I'm like, I got to be back home. And that same sense of, like, ownership isn't the right word, but connection to this space, right? Connection to the land, connection to this community is what animates the decision of people like Dorian Joyce Ladner and Hollis Watkins and some of the other people that we're going to talk about, the young people of the Emmett Till generation, to stay and fight. Whereas the logical thing, many people thought, well, if they're killing people like Emmett Till and other kids, let me get out of here. Let's go. But they made the decision to stay and fight, and it's that base that ultimately allows SNCC, when it comes onto the scene, to actually connect their style of organizing to what's already happening in Mississippi. It's the young people that stayed and the older veterans of the war, that black middle class, that provide the foundation for someone like a Bob Moses. Okay? So I'm going to stop there. That's some contextual language for understanding, like, what Mississippi was before SNCC even gets into the state. I want to invite comments or questions from here in the live audience, but also online. So today we have a mic. So the mic is right here. So if you want to ask a question, speak into the mic so people online can hear you, can hear your question. Or I can keep talking. I know I threw out quite a bit in the first 30 minutes. All right, so nobody's running to the mic. That means we're good, right? All right. At least one. Can you say who you are before your question, please?
Sure.
Yeah. It's for the online audience, so it won't amplify.
Oh, okay. Sure. My name is Melissa. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about Black soldiers who were joining the World War II effort because they saw connections to supporting communism. And so I guess I'm just wondering if, as it sort of became clear that U.S. foreign policy, even during the war, was like moving away from supporting the Soviet Union. If there were writings about that, or if black soldiers were reacting to that.
Yeah. So again, I wouldn't say that this was the majority of black soldiers, but there were a few, like Nelson Peary, who saw it in those particular terms. And the reason that someone like a Nelson Peary could see it that way is he grew up in a community, a mixed race community, where there were not only black communists but multiracial communists organizing already on the table. So he's up there in Wisconsin, I think it is, either Wisconsin or Minnesota. I get it confused. And that's where you have a socialist, movement in many respects. But his groundings there ultimately are affirmed by the fact that without the ideological language of the left, rural soldiers from rural black backgrounds in the South, black soldiers from rural backgrounds in the South, basically had the same analysis of the situation, particularly when it pertained to the white racial animus that they experienced, not only in the South, but in the military itself. It led to a questioning of, why are we fighting for this country when this country means Albany, Georgia, or like what I just experienced, coming home. And so they began to be open to the possibility of confronting the fascism that was in front of their face. And it was but it was people like Nelson Peary, who they're with, right? Other black people from different experiences in the world, in the country, who are able to connect those experiences to the broader things that are happening in the world. And that was a form of like organizing within the military that was happening. Yeah.
How you doing, Tavian? Just for the people online, I think it's a consistent theme. Yesterday's today in general, if you've been paying attention, of this concept of class collaboration that Gerald Holmes speaks about, and you mentioned how the pushback from Brown versus Board sort of radicalized the poor whites as well as the white entrepreneurs. And would you see that as like a retread, like a new social contract in that class collaboration, or just kind of following
an
a
intensification
genealogy?
Yeah, I would see it as an intensification. So we talked about class collaboration during Reconstruction period, and it was not automatic, right? Remember how we talked about how they used the planter class tried to control the black vote, right? And that worked up until a point, but it was to prevent like black working class or black poor workers and white poor workers from actually aligning. And ultimately, Mississippi plan was whiteness coming back and organizing alongside the common notion of whiteness. So obviously, these two factions don't see eye to eye all the time. They don't see eye to eye all the time, and the New Deal era is a space to understand that. It is also very clear that poor whites do not feel the brunt of the economic benefits of the Jim Crow system. Rather, what they gain from it is not being associated with a population that they consider to be, or that the system considered to be, non-persons. That's the key. And 1954 represents a moment where that can be weaponized to maintain the system. So it's not that it was latent before, because we know that, they're attending lynchings and but by 54, the notion of this being uprooted seems possible, right? And so they intensify it to maintain it in the face of that perceived threat. And so that's the word I would use, that it's always there, but it intensifies at certain moments. I think we're living in a moment of intensification right now. Have been for like probably at least 16 years. If you want to date it to 2008, right? Yep. Yes. I guess they can see the mic. See the question. It's a great question. I think we can pursue it by talking about Macomb, the Macomb movement. The Macomb movement is not possible without young people from Mississippi, right? And Brenda Travis, her name comes to me first. Brenda Travis was in high school, participates in direct action, right? In Macomb, Mississippi, 1961. And they throw her out of school. What is it, Bergland High School? Y'all remember the name of the school? Something like that. They throw her out of school. And that was, and also I think they gave her a year in the House of Delinquency or something that they called it, something like that, right? Whatever the euphemism was for jail, right? As an aside, we know that the whole, Saidiya Hartman writes about this beautifully, the whole idea of delinquency, the whole concept was rooted in this notion of reform, that children can be saved from themselves. But the mechanisms for saving these children were often brutally violent and vehemently sexist. And so it's like Angela Davis and others have written, right? Prison is a reform. So you can't reform it. It is a reform. And delinquency was a concept that lended itself to a liberal appropriation of the concept of reform. Liberals loved the prisons because they thought that was the last chance these children would have. It's very ironic then that we get mass incarceration as a consequence of the same liberal ideal, but that's another conversation. But I want to say that because in the South, reform school, or the notion of delinquency at this time, was also a place where they sent troublemakers. But the troublemakers who are attacking, quote unquote, attacking the movement, or attacking the system, I should say, right? And so Brenda Travis, was considered a delinquent for participating in direct action and, leaving school and getting involved in these movement people, right? So she's written about this herself. She also has an autobiography where she talks about this, right? But Macomb, also Travis Britt and many others in Macomb. These students, again, high schoolers, they were inspired to leave school or to participate in the movement because it was their home. And when I say home, I'm talking about, again, the way that Hollis talks about home, and the way that Dorian Joyce talk about home, and the way that peoples in Mississippi remade the land, remade the space in their own image. Which, of course, if you accept the dark state narrative, this idea of Mississippi as a backwater, you'll miss that part. If you never visited Mississippi, you're going to never see it in your life, right? But people who are from Mississippi, they know what I'm talking about. There's a special place that this space has to Black Mississippians. And so for them, here's an opportunity to take that feeling and to express it politically. It was a very attractive thing. That's why the students were so excited when they saw people coming. It's like, y'all know about us? All right, let's do it. That's why Bob Moses, when he was invited to Macomb, is excited by the people that were already there. They give him the energy, right? And so in Macomb, you have E.W. Steptoe. I'm sorry, in the region, the southwest part of the state. So if I had a map of Mississippi, the western part of the state, the southwestern part, is where Macomb is, and you also have the counties, Pike County, Amite County, and other counties. These all had active NAACP chapters led by elders. C.C. Bryant, E.W. Steptoe. These are really important figures, right, from that World War II generation. Young people are also there, but in the middle of that is like someone like Bob Moses, right, who is from Harlem, right? And of course, the narrative is, well, he's an outsider. Well, you don't understand something about black community, then outsiders that can be rectified very quickly. In other words, the way that Charles Payne talks about it is Bob Moses becomes family, right? So the whole concept of outsider means very little when space is remade to include people rather than to fortify boundaries. What is a boundary after all when the space has been remade by the people? And so Bob Moses finds home in Mississippi. He finds family in Mississippi, but he comes with different experiences, right? He comes from Harlem, comes from these elite white educational institutions, right? But he's not coming there as a missionary. He's not coming there as a service provider. He's not coming there as someone who's going to rescue the people, right? And so when they saw that example, like, there's a way that you walk into somebody's house and you speak, right? Metaphorically, that's what Bob Moses did. I'm not just gonna come to your house and not act like I don't got no home training. Like, I know like the terms of how people engage and how to speak to people and how to recognize their humanity in ways that the outside system and society does not. That common idea of blackness and character that Bob Moses exemplifies is how he was accepted by these people as family, which means we now got family that got connections to them freedom riders. All right, we good now because they're watching the freedom rides on TV, right? And reading about it in the press and the news. And it's like, oh, they coming to Mississippi? All right, bet. In fact, the famous story, Hollis and Curtis, right? Hollis Watkins and what's Curtis? Curtis Stokes. I'm getting these names crazy. So many names. But they hear that Martin Luther King is coming to Macomb. And so they go. I want to hear Martin Luther King. Of course, it's not Martin Luther King. It's Bob Moses. It's like, oh. Which I think is even more important because Bob Moses would have been far more accessible to them than King would have been, right, at the time. And they meet Bob Moses, and Bob Moses, who is actually invited into the state by MZ Moore, and the decision is made, we're going to do voter registration. MZ Moore is from Cleveland, Mississippi. MZ Moore meets Bob through Ella Baker. And so all of these things begin to like align and match up perfectly, right? Because Ella Baker and Bob Moses, by the way, are like probably the, if there were two, we don't want to say there are two, but the philosophical brains or the philosophical, it's not brains. The word I'm looking for is the philosophical foundation for organizing, the SNCC model of organizing, right? In fact, you can root much of what SNCC's way of organizing is back to these two figures. And so how they get into Mississippi has a lot to do with Ella Baker's connections to the local people, right? Because Ella Baker was the director of the NAACP's branches. Ella Baker is also the person who is involved in securing the space that becomes the first place where SNCC is founded in Shaw University in April 1960. Ella Baker is a master teacher and organizer. But what she teaches people is that part of organizing is recognizing the strength of the people that you are, in fact, trying to organize. In fact, that's not just part of it. That is it. And she practices that not just in terms of looking at people as a problem to solve, but understanding that just as we are forging community in the space as organizers, there are already communities that have been forged. The challenge is to fuse them together, to actually be one with them, to recognize your oneness. That's the challenge. And Mississippi is a place where they essentially created a laboratory for addressing that challenge. No national organization had ever stepped up to the plate to do something quite like this. We're talking about the reticence of the NAACP, right? And obviously, you can organize the middle class folk in terms of the NAACP, but what about the rural plantation folk? It's not just economic reprisals for them. It's literally reprisals, violent reprisals. Like their physical bodies were under assault, right? And so what does it mean for these principles of organizing that Baker is working through to be tested in a lab like Mississippi? And so MZ Moore is the key. She knows MZ Moore because MZ Moore is NAACP, right? MZ Moore is also not nonviolent. You know? Because they understand that the idea of remaking the land, remaking the space, creating and forging community in a hostile space means you also have to offer protection to people. But the irony of ironies is once this decision is made, so let's for those who need timelines, let's do a timeline real quick. SNCC is founded in 1960, April 1960. Ella Baker is instrumental, right? Also, we have to say this, Ella Baker is using funds from the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But she is insistent that they not tell the students what the organization will be. It's not going to be a youth wing of the SCLC. Let them figure their mission out on their own. We are here to provide support, but as older people, older adults, right, it's not on us to tell the students what to do. The sit-ins were spontaneous. They were planned and spontaneous, right? The sit-in movement then needed to be organized into a common effort. And so the SCLC, which never did a sit-in in its whole life, you can't appropriate these young people's struggle. And I think there's a lesson in that as well. Let them figure it out. Let them decide what they want to be. And so direct action is a big influence, right? MZ Moore is like, yeah, direct action, but let's think about something else. What does it mean for us to organize the vote? Now, they have been struggling around the questions of the ballot for at least two or three generations since disenfranchisement, right? And so MZ Moore, who goes through the experience of the Second World War, who goes through the experience of, the violence of that period, and then he goes through the experience of, post-Brown versus Board of Education context in the state, he is thinking, well, the vote is going to be key. The vote's going to be key here. But the NAACP doesn't really get down with the idea of voter registration, not in the way that the peoples who were local to the state wanted to do it. So July of 1960, Bob Moses visits M.C. Moore. All right? And they start thinking about what they can do. We have an example of someone who's from Harlem, has degrees, educated, brilliant, has the degree in philosophy, master's degree in philosophy, right? Brilliant thinker. And then you have a local organizer and entrepreneur, right? So Moses promises to come back the next summer. So he comes back July 61. June or July 61, right? Payne's book walks us through in granular detail what happens next. And he says in the book that, look, nationally, the intensification that happens in the spring of 1961 with the Freedom Rides is extremely important for understanding the ground trade in Mississippi. In fact, Freedom Riders ended up in Mississippi, or in Parchman Penitentiary, right? Parchman is a prison farm. Some people have made the argument that it was worse than slavery. So that's where they sent the Freedom Riders in Mississippi. You don't have none of that in this state. But they are heroes to the young people like Brenda Travis and June Johnson. These young people who are in high school, the Freedom Riders are heroes. So that's spring 61. Summer 61, Bob Moses is back. And in Payne's account, the elders in the southwest of the state, because Cleveland is in Delta, right? Which is northwest. Southwest of the state, they read it in jet that Bob Moses and M.C. Moore was talking. They say, y'all need to come to Southwest Mississippi. Don't deal with the Delta. Deal with the hill country people. And so they come to the Southwest because the Southwest has both this like conservative white Christian background and these extremely autonomous black people, which meant that they were able to maintain consistency that was not the case in other parts of the state in terms of NAACP membership. It's an interesting dynamic, right? And the other part about it, going back to the class collaboration point, is they beefing with the rich people, with the rich whites and the Deltas. They don't really like each other. So what does it mean when white people don't like each other and their common foe, if you will, black people who believe in self-determination, right? What's the response? Do they unite? Do whites unite? Do they, figure out different methods of dealing with this question? Again, it's a laboratory. People are testing out these new theories. So that's where the Macomb movement really begins. Bob Moses comes and he starts meeting all of these brilliant young people and these committed elders. That's summer and fall 1961. So what's the response? Well, Bob Moses comes with the law. Here's how you register to vote. Here's what you got to do. Finds people that are courageous enough to do it. And what's the response? These are hill country whites. We're not going to ask you nicely to stop what you're doing. The response was violent. You got something?
Yeah. So we got Justin Thomas. He asks, how did Mayor Marion Barry become the first chairman of SNCC?
Awesome.
And how influential was Barry in the movement during the 60s?
That is a great
and you
question.
got one more after that, too.
And it aligns beautifully. Like this question actually aligns with what I'm going to say next, right? So Marion Barry, first chairman of SNCC. I don't know if there was an argument for making him chair. I don't know what it was. But he becomes chair soon after the organization is formally founded in 1960. Marion Barry is native to Mississippi. He's from, Ida Bena, Mississippi. At the time, he is a graduate student, right, in Nashville, Tennessee. A chemist, right? His orientation then aligns with those coming from Nashville. I don't want to say rather than from Mississippi, but there's a certain Nashville flavor to the movement. We just seem like we're losing so many of our elders. But James Lawson recently made his transition. And James Lawson, in our nonviolence direct action syllabus, James Lawson figures prominently in that syllabus. But James Lawson is the architect, in many ways, of the philosophy of nonviolence in the United States. When I say philosophy, what I mean is people who believe that it was a way of life, not a tactic, but a way of life. And this is a debate in SNCC. John Lewis, right? Bernard Lafayette. They believe in nonviolence. Like, this is who you should be, right? And Lawson is key, but Marion Barry is with them. And Marion Barry, interestingly enough, is on one side of the fence when voter registration gets on the table. He's on the direct action side of the fence. And so any SNCC history will have this duality, right? In 1961, a year after it's founded, the organization is debating whether it should be focused on direct action, meaning the sit-ins, the legacy of the sit-ins, or voter registration, right? Barry comes into Mississippi at the same time as Bob Moses. And the students, young people like Brenda, that's why she gets in trouble, remember? They're like, let's do direct action too. Like, let's go. Let's do sit-ins too, right? Let's do protest rallies too. Let's do that kind of work as well. And Marion Barry is helping them, right? He's actually deeply influential in helping him. And also, you have people in the state doing citizenship education, like James Bevel and Diane Nash are in the state as well. And so, once Bob Moses and SNCC and more SNCC staffers get into the state, more people start coming. And it's ironic that, this idea of direct action and voter registration plays out in Macomb itself. Like they're doing both in Macomb, because ultimately Ella Baker, again, we're not going to tell you what to do, but we're here to support you. She says, why not just have two wings of the same organization? Why not just have some people focused on voter reg and other people focused on direct action? And eventually what that did was the conflict between the two sides fizzles out. And they recognize that both things can happen simultaneously, can work together. And the reason that Mississippians, like Amzie Moore, for instance, didn't necessarily want to focus on direct action is because a lot of them came from self-contained autonomous communities. We don't need to sit at your lunch counter. We can eat ourselves. Right? There's that energy. But also when you get into the cities, right, or the towns, direct action becomes much more of a feature of the movement, because you want to be able to access things that you need. So there's that duality again between like the maroon sensibility among African America, right? That's deeply rooted in places like Mississippi. Like, we can do stuff on our own. But don't try us, right? And then there's the notion of, well, the society needs to be broken open for everybody. And so those two things again aren't necessarily, as you can probably sense, antagonistic all the time, but it does lead to people weighing one against the other at certain points. And I think that the fact that philosophical nonviolence comes into the equation kind of rubs some people in Mississippi the wrong way. Now, what do you mean you're philosophically devoted to not fighting? And so some of you may have heard the famous quote, Hartman Turnbow, from also a local organizer, elder in Mississippi. This nonviolent stuff will get you killed, which is the title of Charlie Cobb's book on the prevalence of armed struggle and self-defense in the movement. And so Mississippi is different, right? As I said on yesterday, We Will Shoot Back by Akinyele Umoja actually walks us through not just the philosophy of nonviolence, but how self-defense manifested as an alternative to the philosophy of nonviolence, or people who never felt that they would be philosophically devoted to it, but may use it as a tactic, which is the difference between Nashville and other factions in SNCC. We'll use it as a tactic, right? But we're not philosophically devoted to it, which is a very difficult thing to do. And in fact, Kwame Ture talks about how much discipline it takes to be philosophically devoted to it, right? I mean, what's your limit to? It takes a lot of discipline, right? How many cheeks do I have to turn? And so it's not to say that, to create a hierarchy, but it's to say that there's a difference between how people made sense of the prevalence of violence and how people made sense of what we might do next. So that's Marion Barry. And like I said, he's right there in Macomb with some of these students at the same time that Bob Moses is. Second question.
I don't want to mess this name up. Onyema. Can you talk about the role of the Black Teachers Unions in Mississippi and to what extent they laid some groundwork for the Freedom Schools?
Say it again.
Can you talk about the role of the Black Teachers Unions in Mississippi and to what extent they laid some groundwork for the Freedom Schools?
That I can't talk about. I don't know. I don't know if anyone here knows the answer to that one. Teachers unions. So we do have a day devoted to the Freedom School concept. I think Dr. Allegra will be taking on that one. The unions, I just don't know. I know that there is the example of Black teachers doing more, right, than what the curriculum provided for. And that knowledge or that example being critical to the Freedom Schools. I do know that teachers are hugely responsible for the citizenship schools, and the citizenship schools absolutely, and Braden and others, have a presence in Mississippi. Septima Clark and the concept of, creating these kinds of structures, but I don't know where that intersects with the unions. So that's a great question. It's a great question. Is that it? All right, cool. Not Curtis Stokes, Curtis Hayes. I'm sorry, y'all. I knew that was wrong because Curtis Stokes is somebody completely different. So Curtis Hayes and Hollis Watkins are the two major figures who inspired by the fact that Martin Luther King was coming, but it was really Bob Moses, and they go into Macomb. From the Delta, they go into Macomb, and they meet some of the people who are from Macomb, like Brenda Travis. And like I said, they were met with violence. And so Payne tells some of these stories, Bob Moses being hit over the head, jailed, There are also stories of some of the children being jailed, but the white power structure knew that in order to really get the repression right, they had to go after the elders, and they knew that economic reprisals probably would not be enough, right? And so the assassination of Herbert Lee in Mississippi, the fall of 1961, I think it was October 1961, was really a pivotal, as pivotal as the killing of Medgar Evers 2 years later, as pivotal as the killing of Emmett Till, 1955, 6 years earlier. Like, Herbert Lee's assassination showed what the price was going to be for people who were directly involved in movement work. Remember, Emmett Till ain't in the movement, right? But Herbert Lee is. He is, a farmer, but he had a vehicle, so he would transport the students around town. And that was enough. And to make it worse, he actually was killed by his childhood friend, which means that there was interracial friendship among children, but they grew up into their whiteness and then become the people that oppose you. And so his assassination, obviously, there was no one held accountable, right? But this assassination was a pivotal moment because more students become radicalized as a consequence, and they lead this huge protest rally. And those students who were involved in that were kicked out of school. And so eventually they, are not allowed to go to school. I think one of the HBCUs allows them to come to get their educations, but the bulk of them spend a month in jail. They spend a month in jail, and a lot of people in the Black community were upset, putting our children at risk. And I'll never forget reading the first time I read I've Got the Light of Freedom, and Herbert Lee, because George Lee is later. Oh my God, so many. But Herbert Lee's widow blames Bob Moses. You killed my husband. You killed my husband. At that point, I'm leaving. I'm like, I'm done. Like, really? Because in some ways, I have to accept that she's partially right. I mean, the human sacrifices. And that's not to take any of the autonomy or any of the agency away from a Herbert Lee, right? He knew what he was getting involved in. And he still did it, right? And I'm sure there was some internal conflict around it, but the idea that if there was no movement, there would have been no violence probably makes logical sense, but it also makes sense that this is what we have to do to actually force transformation. And so why Bob Moses didn't quit at that point, and why Chuck McDougall and Marion Barry and Bob Zellner and everybody that was in Macomb didn't just walk away at that point, therein lies the lesson of the Macomb movement, which might be read as a failure because once they were jailed, it was like, we can't go back, at least right now. But the lesson is the movement didn't end at that point. It does not end. And so pursuing this particular question of what to do next really is how the road to Freedom Summer is tread. So before we open it up to more of a discussion, there is one more thing, the last question on the syllabus that we need to pursue, and that is the role of the Democratic Party in all of this. And I think it has everything to do with why there were members of SNCC that were confident enough to go into Mississippi, given the history of racist terror and violence. And so the voter education project is key here. So is the Council of Federated Organizations. And so I think we need to spend some time talking a little bit about what these two formations were, because without them, it's hard to imagine that there is a Freedom Summer or a Freedom Democratic Party. But SNCC is very much aligned and in tension with both. Right? Bob Moses' 1966 interview, that was the first source for this session today, talks about what it was for COFO and the VEP and other formations to come into Mississippi. And the Council of Federated Organizations was a collaboration between the NAACP, the SCLC, CORE, and other major organizations. And Aaron Henry, who's another indigenous leader from Mississippi, NAACP leader, is one of the founding members of COFO. You also have Dave Dennis of CORE and many other people who are there. And COFO basically says, in 1961, let's come together, trade notes, figure out what we can do to create a common program. And here comes the Kennedy administration knocking, right? And I think here is a really important connection, right? Because Kennedy and his brother, Bob, or Robert F. Kennedy, they are thinking, is it F? I don't know. RFK, yeah. Robert F. Kennedy. They're still around, aren't they? They're concerned, of course, about the idea of staying in power. The Democratic Party is very much, kind of won, not by a thread, but Nixon could have easily got him in 1960, right? The perpetual failure of Richard Nixon is something to study, but finally he wins. But how does Nixon win in the end? Racist. Anyway, RFK and JFK are thinking about the black vote as a way to stay in power, right? And so they could see what would happen eventually. And they knew that we have to solidify, our hold on this particular office. And the way that we might be able to do it was to bring black voting power back to the table, which hadn't been utilized for almost 100 years at that point on a national level. I mean, you have black folks voting Democrat in the northern cities, right? And even then, it's, voter apathy was a huge issue, and how do you organize that? And, the very clear enemy of Jim Crow wasn't as present in terms of an electoral possibility, which is why, third parties were such, I think the third party movements in the North, we go back to the Progressive Party in 1948, or you go even further than that, they were actually viable if they could create a program around race, which they couldn't, which is like, yeah. So the Democrats were like, well, let's create a program around race. And the only program that you can create around race in 1960s Mississippi is voter registration. And so they get these foundations involved because obviously, given the laws, and James Forman talks about this in his short chapter, Attack the Power Structure, which is a really brilliant, even in its brevity, it's a brilliant foray into SNCC at the time and its relationship to voter reg. But they have to use like the Field Foundation funds and other foundation monies because, There's something about tax exempt status, and Democratic Party can't whatever the law was, right? And so it's like a shell organization. But obviously it's Democrats, and that's the thing that where you're talking about Paul Freimer, political scientists at Princeton, other people, this idea of electoral capture, this notion that if you're going to vote, we know that you're going to vote for us, but we don't know that you're going to vote, right? Which sadly is less and less true today. There's some people probably want to stay at home in the black community with this upcoming election, sadly. It's not funny, but it is. Oh my God. It's like, yeah, some people don't want you to vote. which speaks to, of course, the failures of the Democratic Party. But again, in the 1960s, it was clear that if they're going to vote for us. Therefore, the question is, how do we get them registered to vote? 1960 into 1961 into 1962, the W.E.B is born. The problem is SNCC is the only real organization doing voter registration work. Through COFO, they get funded through the W.E.B. That makes sense? So it's not like the Democratic Party is writing SNCC a check and saying work for us, which probably was how it would be now. Or some organization through the Democratic Party would be like, organize for me. SNCC takes the money and then says, we're taking this money and going into the rural areas of the state and organizing. Foreman puts it beautifully. He says, and also Cortland Cox in the epigraph to the syllabus itself, both of them say that to the major players in the Democratic Party, to the major players in the civil rights establishment, the only people that mattered when it came to voter registration were the people who were middle class and lived adjacent or in cities. Go to Jackson, Mississippi. Don't go to Greenwood. Because for them, it's a numbers game. For SNCC, it's a numbers game for a different reason. It's not just let's get more votes for this particular party, so let's go where we can have the most potential likely voters. For SNCC, the numbers game was let's go to the places where we actually have a numerical majority and can actually take power. Local elections. I'm not sure JFK cared who the sheriff was in Greenwood County, but that mattered to black people. And so when you look at the analysis that Jim Foreman puts into that chapter, he goes state by state in the major southern states, the counties that we need to target, and here's why. It's really a beautiful report that he gives or that he shares in that chapter. And he says, this was at odds with what the National Democratic Party wants, which is why, going back to that conflict between direct action and voter reg, the direct action people is like, yeah, y'all voter reg people, y'all are tools of the Democrats. They have co-opted our struggle. But Bob Moses and them are like, wait a minute. We're going to use this little bit of money that we're getting, and we're going to, in James Foreman's terms, expose the system and expose the structure. Its weakness is they don't think that we can organize 50% or 70% of this county, which is black. And they got another thing coming. But here's the rub, and this is why they believed it would work without the violence. If this is sanctioned by the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party is in power, which means that they control the DOJ, then if something happens to us, they should show up and help. They did not show up and help. Not consistently, not effectively. They could not stop the violence. But it was just like the wars in the sense that, oh, we shooting our former masters with the Union Army guns. So this time, oh, we're going to register people to vote, but we are sanctioned by, if not sanctioned by, protected by the DOJ. In fact, they said they would help. And in an indirect way, they're funding this. But the FBI stood by and watched some of this violence happen. You have exceptions. John Doerr, DOAR, who worked for the DOJ, who could be called upon to provide some assistance at some times. But the average FBI agent in the state would not protect, could not be trusted. Over time, SNCC develops a distrust in the federal government, Kennedy's federal government. And so, whereas the V.E.P. offers like this opportunity to do things, to maneuver, it does not give SNCC its own, it does not generate a strategy for SNCC. SNCC generated its own strategy. SNCC generated its own strategy. And eventually, SNCC learned that the question of protection would not be resolved by the federal government, which is probably a difficult lesson to accept. Especially for the philosophically nonviolent folk, right? Can't call the cops? All right. What are you going to do? Maybe somebody needs to have a pistol. And so that's all very, very important, because when Freedom Summer comes, what you going to do to protect all these volunteers? Right? But I think the political question of whether or not this was, the backroom maneuverings of the Democratic Party is also critical. Because if you read closely, they couldn't determine what SNCC's strategy was going to be. SNCC said, ultimately, SNCC organizers, like Moses said, it's up to the people to determine the political agenda. No, that means that they will vote, Democrat in the 1964 election, then fine. And they did. But that's not the point. The point was, how do you empower people locally to transform their situations? And in Mississippi in 1961, the vote as a way to maneuver, as a way to disrupt, was a key tool. And that's why they eventually landed on voter registration as a major tactic in the state. Macomb was the first foray, and Macomb represented perhaps the most significant lessons of the SNCC organizing method, and that was you go into a community to be a part of it, not to service it, not to rescue it. What does it mean to be a part of it? This is where I get real spiritual, right? Because ultimately, Black people believe we are connected in some cosmic way. That's what this whole system has forced us into, but we do it on our own terms still, right? It's not that Blackness is enough. It's that people who are told that they are Black figure out what it takes to create the cosmic oneness that's going to let us survive this. We know how to do that, but you can't do it. Let me say it another way. It's not automatic. You have to work at it. And so we're going to open it up for discussion in a second, but I just want to give the story that I often give about how this was possible for SNCC to do, because I'm listening to young organizers today, and it's like, well, where do I go to get this, and how do I give it to somebody else, and what if they don't like me, and what if I can't talk to them, and what if they reject me, and all these different things. And I think that SNCC folks were thinking about that as well. But to go back to our conversation about the young people who saw these people as people that they wanted to be around, character, meaning this notion that I represent something beyond me, that my sense of myself is not rooted in arrogance, it's not rooted in this notion that I'm above you. Like Ella Baker taught that, right? That doesn't mean that these were saints, but it does mean that, in fact, having character doesn't mean that you're always a saint either, right? But it does mean that these people felt that part of their politics was the denial of the self and the elevation of the we. And so my favorite way to explain this, probably because I'm a Howard person, is through the tutelage of one of the other adults who never set foot in 1960s in Mississippi, but his connection to the people that did was foundational, just as Ella Baker's was foundational. But his name rarely shows up in this context, and that's Sterling Brown. Sterling Brown, there's like 3 Sterling Browns. There's an NBA player. He's still in the NBA? Hopefully he is. There's the actor. And then there's like Sterling Brown's father, Sterling Nelson, big deal in Washington, D.C. I'm talking about Sterling Allen Brown, Sterling A. Brown. And I tell this story because Brown had to fight his own battles at Howard University between people who did not believe that the rural folk in the South had anything to give us, which is extremely critical to understanding a place like Mississippi. Like I said yesterday, like these people have a tradition of rebellion. Not only that, they created the blues. And those two things together tells us that there is a sensibility here. And you might not think that it's sufficiently radical if you don't understand that sensibility, if you don't live it, if you don't make community with these people, right? And I often argue, going back to my problems with political theory, is the categories that we have to study politics don't fit Black Mississippi. And so you can say silly things like, well, they are inherently conservative because they believe this, or that they're not sufficiently. No, just stop. Listen to what they're saying, and you'll find that at the core of any political tradition is belief. You're struggling with revolutionary theory because you don't believe. These people believe. How else do you explain getting on a bus to go register to vote and you know you're going to get your ass kicked? And doing it to song. This ain't got nothing to do with political ontology. In fact, it's a disruption of it. In fact, when we get the vote, we're going to surprise you with what we do and with what we imagine, with what we can do with it. Which is why the Democratic Party was in over its head when they thought that they could control this thing. Just give us the money. You can go away because you're not going to get it. And we're going to put, his picture in the house and confuse you even further. Why do Black people got JFK's picture in the house? It's not about politics. This is a symbol. Don't read it through, any political theorist. They're not thinking about that. And so spirituality is key, right? Culture is key because it'll have you misreading the people if you don't understand those concepts. Which is why, again, I appreciate the way that Hollis Watkins begins his autobiography in that particular space. And so Sterling Brown actually taught that to the SNCC organizers from Howard University. He gave them the vision. He gave them a way of seeing all of that. That's Black studies. How do I see my people? How do they show up? How do they see me? And what can we accomplish together through that vision? Sterling Brown told people like Kwame Ture and Gene Wheeler and Dion Diamond and Cortland Cox and Charlie Cobb and Muriel Tillinghast and many others who went to Howard or came through Howard and sat at his feet like Ed Brown, yes, Ed Brown, and his younger brother, H. Rap Brown. We didn't have to learn too much from his feet because they from Louisiana, right? But he taught them how to see us. Tim Jenkins taught them how to see us. Michael Thelwell taught them how to see us. And so as the story goes, Sterling Brown would bring them all together, these young men and women who were part of the Nonviolent Action Group, Howard students who were protesting all around the city and on campus. He would bring them together. They would sit around in his office. He would pull out a fifth of Wild Turkey. That's whiskey, right? I'm not a Wild Turkey drinker. I don't know. And I always tell my students when I tell this story, if your professor does this now, run. This is acceptable in 1961. It is not acceptable in 2024. They pull out a fifth of anything, run. But he would pull out the fifth and they would drink and he would tell stories, literally stories. He could say, I'm going to tell some lies today. I'm not going to give you a political education. I'm not going to give you the history of the Constitution. I'm not going to even give you a lecture on literature. I'm going to tell some lies, which is another way of knowing. He's talking about the tradition of Black tall tales. And when you understand that tradition, people like Lawrence Levine much later in his book, Black Culture and Consciousness, will talk about this, right? Sterling Stuckey much later would talk about this as a historical example. Those traditions have lessons, but more than just morals, but they have political, spiritual, cultural resonance in ways that translate the experiences of the folk that social sciences have still not caught up to. A social science comes with a questionnaire and tries to figure out what people think. No, let me tell you this lie. Right? Let me tell you this story about Slim Greer in hell. Slim Greer in hell? What are you talking about? Brown, when he gets his degrees, he goes to Virginia and Missouri and all these places, and he picks up that tradition. And it blows his mind. It's like, wait a minute, y'all got explanations for everything. Like, this is almost a total theory of knowledge. But in the academy at the time, that doesn't count as knowledge. And so he has to go to art. He has to go to poetry. He puts it in his poetry. And he puts it in his teaching, more importantly, right? He says, I'm a minor poet, but I'm a major teacher. And so every Howard student that encounters him gets that side of him as well. But the NAG students, they wanted more and more and more. They came to class, then they came to his office and drank with him after class. And then he's like, y'all hungry? Let's go home. His wife had sandwiches waiting. As soon as they got into the door, they go into the basement. He puts on these blues records. He says, this is what you got to understand Black people. He didn't have no Spotify playlist. He had to go record by record And he had it arranged in such a way, like, this is the evolution of the sound. And the young people in NAG are like, did you just explain black people to us? Like, what is this? Because they weren't getting that in any other space at Howard. And they came back and back and back and back. And then people like Sterling Stuckey would come down from Chicago and sit with him. And, you know, his other students like Toni Morrison and Amir Baraka, they put it in their work. It's like, wait a minute. This full spectrum of like knowledge that comes from the ability of this particular figure to ingest and translate and recover and reimagine this thing that we're calling black popular culture and folk culture into an idiom that is then applicable to how we get people to vote in Mississippi. Because those same people that's sitting around his office drinking whiskey are now in the juke joint in Mississippi trying to organize. And it's not a lead now. You're in the right place. Or on Sunday morning when they go to church, you're still in the right place. Because one thing about Mississippi, you had to go to church every Sunday. And if you didn't go to church, it's like, what's wrong with you? And I experienced that for the first time, not in Mississippi, but in Texas. It's crazy. I was in Texas for Juneteenth weekend, and you were there, Chris. And you didn't see this, but after the talk that I gave, and then even the next day when I was at Pan-African Connection, people were like, so what church are you going to Sunday? I'm like, this is not part of the tour. What are you talking about? No, the expectation is you go to church because we're having church, not because you got to give a talk. So it's like, oh, yeah, of course. It makes sense. That was in Mississippi as well. And so if you're going to go into Laurel or if you're going to go to even like Hattiesburg, what church you going to? Are you going to church with us, right? Don't say no, because now you lost him. And so I tell the story of Sterling Brown to exemplify that it's in these culture carriers that we gain access to these really important political lessons that then are applied in the theater of organizing. It shapes Kwame Ture. And it's almost like Sterling Brown is not just, it's not like the banking model of education where I'm just putting stuff in your head. Sterling Brown is doing something very simple. He's holding up a mirror. Don't look at the book, look at yourself. What do you see? Do you see yourself? Do you see our people? That's the organizing tradition that Bob and others were trying to test in this laboratory in Mississippi. And they did it. One of the reasons they debated Freedom Summer was these volunteers are random. They ain't go through what we did in order to get here, right? And that's a valid debate. It's a valid question, and we'll get to that. But it takes time to develop that rapport and connection. And it's difficult to imagine a Freedom Summer without Macomb 1961. That's the point. Tomorrow, we're going to pick up the discussion with Greenwood, because that was the next step. Greenwood is different. It's in the Delta. Because between 62 and the beginning of Freedom Summer, they applied those lessons, whether they got it from Sterling Brown or Ella Baker or from the Macomb, quote unquote, failure. They applied those lessons and they won. I would say they won. In fact, we can probably discuss that at length, but Greenwood was a victory for me because it took a space, not that there was no activity, but it felt like there was no activity, or it felt like nothing was happening. And they made it into one of the most vibrant examples of how to organize a community that we've ever had, which directly energizes Freedom Summer 1964. So in these last few minutes, I'll invite some discussion, questions or comments that you all might have about anything that we've talked about. Yeah. Get the
mic. My name is Miguel. When you mentioned Kennedy earlier, when I was reading Radical Equations earlier by Bob Moses, he was saying how when him and a dozen or so people were arrested, while the Department of Justice had that lawsuit against Mississippi too, they were supposed to protect voter registration.
Right.
Kennedy and his brother basically get the concession of them getting released from jail, but they had to drop the lawsuit against that the Department of Justice had against Mississippi. Yeah. And thinking about yesterday, we were talking about racial fortuity and Derek Bell and that. But that concession ultimately was just a consolidation of white power and the retrenchment and black rights. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that influenced how they saw the rest of the next couple of years. Yeah. But
it's like, what are you gonna do? Stay in jail?
Right.
It's like these impossible choices, right? But then it reveals that for the government or for the Kennedys, this is political calculation. This ain't about our lives. You had the power to get me out of jail without doing that. You're the president. So yeah.
And thinking about Marronage, Petit Marronage, Grand Marronage.
Yes.
For that time period, how would you in that range of Marronage, where would you place direct action and the voter registration effort? Obviously different circumstances, different time period, but I was just fascinated.
So by that you mean whether or not black people bought into either of those tactical decisions? Yeah. I don't think it was Grand Marronage. So for those who don't know these concepts, so marronage is a tactic, way of life, political project, any manner of ways of describing how enslaved people created communities outside of the boundaries of the plantation that were autonomous. Robin D.G. Kelly says that marronage is the first principle of African resistance. The first thing that we did was get away from you and build a society for ourselves. And what's beautiful about marronage is it welcomed everybody who wanted to live like that. Indigenous peoples, whites, whoever decided that plantation life is not for me could come to a maroon space. And we conceptually, those who study marronage have been linking it to post-enslavement era forms of resistance. And so the spaces and territories that we create that are autonomous, that don't link to the capitalist mode of production, right? You can't ever be fully outside, and the maroon societies were not ever fully outside, which is why rebellion became a possibility later on. But what can we do in these moments of reprieve? And so petit marronage were those temporary or those moments of reprieve, whereas grand marronage is the attempt to make the moment of reprieve a permanent condition. So hopefully in these last few minutes, because we need to do a whole course on marronage, that makes a little bit of sense. And so this question is, well, what's the link between these Mississippians and marronage? And for me, it's not necessarily grand marronage, though Mound Bayou and other spaces who are not necessarily untouched by the movement, but certainly there's a tradition of us seeing ourselves as unconcerned with the machinations of the American political project over there because we have our own space over here, even as we know it's potentially threatened, right? So yeah, for them, the right to vote mattered, but it was not necessarily their concern. Their concern was how do we create forms of security for ourselves, or how do we maintain our access to land? And what's also critical is that even as that is happening, they have the stories of the people whose lands were taken. They have the story whose peoples who, because they did not have the right to vote, could not protect themselves from these certain incursions on their land, even as the right to vote wasn't formal protection, but it wasn't permanent protection from that. And so what the movement does is even forces, those who have that tradition to reassess. And I like the way that Charles Payne talks about some of these stories, because there's a whole chapter of, people like the Green family, for instance, like, we're relatively good, right? We're over here, we have our farm, we have this, or we have our space and we have this. And then it's like, there's a threat. Do we respond to the threat by, staying inward, which is an option, or remaining focused on the inward? Or do we use our resources to support people? And it's not that people chose one answer to that question. There's multiple ways of answering that question. And so for me, grand marriage could only work if the entire nation believed in it. However you define nation, right? And until that happened, those who creating those temporary reprieves are going to create temporary reprieves. That's the way I see it. And which means that the forms of petit marronage were more viable ways of thinking about it. So you had to have a base. And some petit maroons were able to create bases and use that base as a weapon in the fight. And so if there was no, for instance, place for Bob Moses to lay his head that was unmolested by whites, then Bob Moses couldn't organize. That's the form of petit maroons. Because there's some places in Mississippi white people won't go. And we don't think about that. We won't talk about that during this period. Akinyele Umoja does in his book. But if you read the history of us catching L's the whole time, we don't realize there's some places white people would not go. And those are the places where we could shelter. Right? So, yeah. Yes. Okay.
So Kia asked, can you speak about the ever-present reality of threat of death in the movement? I've talked with some original Black Panthers, and there were an awareness that if the movement meant their lives, so be it. So for SNCC members in Mississippi, what were their terms? Was it in some ways that I would rather die in the movement than not in the movement by direct action than inaction, as I heard Cortland Cox say last year when he asked about such resolve? He says, we were not courageous, we were determined.
I agree with Cortland. Belief, going back to that word, and this has to be our last question. Well, not last question for today. But belief. To me, that helps us understand the courage and the determination. And whether or not you want to call yourself courageous or determined, it doesn't matter if you don't believe in something. Right? What did these people believe in? And I think about Diane Nash a lot. And then I'm going to tell a story about Haiti. I'm going to go, it's not random, but I think it connects. Diane Nash was asked during one of the freedom rides, aren't you scared? You know that they'll kill you, right? And she said, yes. Not that she didn't say she was afraid. She said, I know that they'll kill us. In fact, I've already written my will. I mean, what is that? To me, like, we don't even have the language to explain what that is. Neither courage nor determination explains that kind of resolve, right? She knew. And yet she still. So, the story about Haiti. and I always tell this one. The Haitian Revolution was a revolution that was fought over the very terms of what kind of society, what kind of lives we would have. And when you participate in a revolution, you know that death is a possibility. And even more so when you were cornered. It's something that's also connected to the SNCC way as well. The whole concept of the Black Panther that they generate. It's like the animal is cornered, it'll fight back, right? What does it mean to be cornered and to know that you can't escape, that escape is not possible? That's what the belief comes in, right? I'm not doing this for just me, or I'm not doing this for any individual act of heroism. I'm doing this to understand that my sacrifice means that life changes to somebody else. And so African spirituality is a major consideration. And I don't think that was absent from the 1960s iteration of the struggle. I think it was fused together with Christianity in a very complex, syncretism that, the way that we understand and believe, that we really believe that we're going somewhere better. And so death can't be the end. And therefore, I'm still going to fight. But in this story of in Haiti, there was a mother and her three daughters. They got captured. They were revolutionaries, and they got captured. And they were being sent to the gallows. It's French barbarism. You can't just, got to hang you. And, you got to do all kind of stuff to your body and all this other stuff. And one of the daughters, maybe two of them, was kind of downcast and, was sad. It's like, I'm about to die. Oh my God, Mom, you're going to die. And the mother says, straighten up your face. Look forward. Don't you know how to die? What is that? How do you understand that? And so the only way that we can make sense of that, and in some ways this probably don't make sense to try to make sense of it, right? But the only way that we can begin to make sense of that is by orienting ourselves around belief. And this notion that what we are facing here on top of the earth is not the only reality that we are a part of. Death is a material question. Yassine Bey, I think it was Yassine Bey. He said, life is what death can't kill. And we were fighting for life. We were fighting for life. And so death didn't matter. That's the way to understand it. I guess we have to end there. Thank you. Tomorrow we're going to get into the Freedom Summer proper for the first time. We had to have some, we had to build up to it. And I think even on the syllabus, it's like week 6 or 7 until we get to Freedom Summer proper. And so look at the readings, and I look forward to the discussion tomorrow.